I'm David Acton, Curator of Photographs at the Snipe Museum of Art at the University of Notre Dame, here with some ideas on our exhibition Touchstones of the 20th Century. Today I'd like to talk about Eugene Smith, probably the most important photojournalist of the 20th century, a photographer who had a special relationship with Notre Dame. Smith was born in 1918 in Wichita, and from an early age he was fascinated by photographs and by airplanes. His mother was a photographer, and she taught him the techniques of shooting and developing. And even as a high school student, he made photographs for the local newspaper. Many of these represented local sports teams, such as the one on the left. The photograph on the right is a portrait of a fellow high school student made when Smith was a teenager. At that time, he applied for and was awarded a scholarship to study at the University of Notre Dame, where his tuition payments were supplemented by his work as a photographer around the university, specializing in sports imagery. In the summer before Gene matriculated at the university, his father committed suicide with Gene's own gun. Nevertheless, Smith started at Notre Dame in the fall of 1936. Smith was very close to his mother throughout his life, and their relationship is documented in a series of letters. So close were they that many of the letters represent disagreements about Smith's behavior and his ambitions. He proved to be a great photographer at Notre Dame and made exciting images of the football team, the basketball team, and the hockey team. He also photographed officials and visitors to the university. However, during this time, Smith's ambition as a photographer began to coalesce. Away from Wichita, he realized how skilled and how talented he really is. His letters to his mother express his interest in capturing action in his photographs, which are particularly exciting in his shots at Notre Dame. Having decided personally to become a photojournalist, Smith began to think about leaving the university and going to New York to study and to begin working. He wrote this to his mother, who declined his ambitions and urged him to stay at the university. However, late in his second term, Smith began to write to her about how his grades were failing and that he was worried he would lose his scholarship. This all came to a head toward the end of the second term when he left for New York and wrote to his mother that he had failed a history exam and that his scholarship was in danger. The fact is, his grade point was certainly high enough to keep his scholarship. In New York, Smith attended the Academy of Photography and began his work photographing in the city and making sports photographs such as the Sandlot baseball game on the right. It turns out Smith was not failing at all, and he claimed a professor at Notre Dame had mixed up his test book with another Gene Smith. Clearly, this was a fiction, but Smith was in New York to stay. He got projects from Time magazine and from Black Star Photographic Agency and soon began a bumpy but successful career as a photojournalist. In 1942, Smith was sent to the South Pacific during World War II by Life magazine. He photographed on Guam and Saipan and made remarkable images not only of the action, but very sympathetic personal portraits like that of the Marine on the right. The influences of his studies are apparent in this strong composition in which the Marine drinking from the canteen looks to his left, while his colleague in the background looks to his right, and yet holds his rifle in such a way that the eye is drawn in a strong diagonal up to the left. Although most of the photographs that we see by Smith represent the heat of the battle or the difficult lives of the soldiers, much of his time was spent in boredom, as you can see in this self-portrait on the left. And of course, Smith took hundreds, thousands of exposures for each one that was published. Here are two battle photographs by Smith, the one on the left a print in the Snight collection. This was a period in which photojournalist's job was finished as soon as his film was sent back to the publisher. During World War II, the exposed film was printed in New York and then censored and then passed by the censors before images were selected for publication. This is the photograph by Eugene Smith in our exhibition, which represents a moment from the Battle of Saipan. Smith and his comrades were going through the jungle trying to flush out the Japanese army and Japanese civilians who had fled into the forest when the Americans attacked. Many of them took refuge in caves, and some committed seppuku there. While climbing the rocky hills, Smith and his colleagues heard a baby's cry and found this infant secreted in a cleft in the rock. This is the moment when a young soldier reaches down to save the baby from his rocky hiding place. And Smith took a sequence of photographs as the infant was passed from one soldier to another to a waiting jeep and taken from there off to a field hospital. Once again, you can see that strong diagonals and crisscrossing glances are important in Smith's composition. It was during the battle at Saipan that Smith himself was wounded by flying shrapnel. He was hit in the face and very seriously wounded and sent back to the United States for a year's rehabilitation in 1945. Afterwards, Smith returned to New York and in 1946 continued to rest and recuperate while taking his own photographs. And the story is that this photograph of his two young children, Pat and Juanita, aged 4 and 2, was the first photograph he exposed after the war. This image, called A Walk to the Enchanted Garden, was later selected by Edward Steichen for his famous exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in 1955 and was used to close that exhibition. Smith returned to Life magazine in 1947 and soon was sent out into the field to work on photo essays for publication in the magazine. This was a time when Life magazine had become the most powerful organ of journalism in the United States. Its circulation was around 9 million weekly, and in the period before television, this was a way that most Americans got their news and entertainment through visual form. These images are from Smith's photo essay called Country Doctor from 1948, and it represents images from the life of a doctor out in the country in Colorado with whom Smith lived for several weeks while collecting the photographs for this essay. You notice how many of these images look like stage sets. Smith was a great fan of the theater and attended the theater in New York City as often as possible when he was home. And these images of caregiving were perfect for the American public just after the war, when consideration for returning veterans and for people who are trying to put their lives back together was a continuing part of the war effort, even after the combat had ceased. These are two images from Smith's photo essay, Spanish Village, published in Life in 1951. This gave the American public a sense of life in a war-torn Europe and the traditional ways of living of those people. We see the famous spinner on the right, and on the left, the women of a village gathered to mourn the death of an old man. Here are two images from Smith's Life magazine photo essay, Nurse Midwife, published in 1951. which represents the life and experiences of Maud Callan, a nurse midwife in Pineville, South Carolina. When working on these series, Smith lived with his subjects and took advantage of the opportunity to photograph them 24 hours a day. This was particularly powerful when Maud Cullen was called out in the middle of the night for a delivery. At this time, it was expected that photographers would turn in their exposed film to Life magazine and that the laboratory technicians would do the developing, the editors would select the images and lay out the photo essay. Smith had none of this. He insisted that he should lay out the essay and design the images across the spreads in the magazine. Naturally, this caused great disruption. Smith reasoned and argued with the editors that if they had spent time in the field, they would know which images were most important and how a narrative could best be set out. So Smith was continually fired from Life magazine and then picked up again later because he was such a great photographer. He was paid a great salary at this time, was able to buy a house for his wife and 4 children in Croton-on-Hudson, north of the city. So it was a constant battle back and forth. Late in the 1940s, Smith once again visited Notre Dame to create the photo essay A Germ-Free Life, making photographs at the Laboratory of Bacteriology at Notre Dame. He made thousands of photographs of the scientists and students working in the laboratory, doing their research, and caring for the laboratory animals. Here are 2 images from that photo essay. One, Life magazine sent Smith to Africa to photograph the activities of Dr. Albert Schweitzer in what was then Gabon. It was a very expensive enterprise. The photographer spent 3 months living in the jungle with Albert Schweitzer and made over 5,000 photographs. The remarkable photo essay published in Life magazine afterwards did little to balance the expense of the expedition. So the battles that Smith continued to have with the editors ended in his resigning from Life magazine in 1954. In 1955, Smith's mother died. She had been working as his business manager from a distance and was also a constant support for him personally in his battles with the editors of Life magazine. And at that time, Smith seemed to begin personal crisis. In March 1955, Magnum Photography Agency sent Smith to Pittsburgh for a 3-week assignment. He was meant to complete 100 selected photographs for a scripted essay. In the event, Smith stayed for months and exposed 22,000 photographs for a photo essay that he saw as his magnum opus. After World War II, Pittsburgh was beginning to change from a center for industrial production to one of knowledge and research. Here are 2 of Smith's images. On the right, a landscape view, and on the left, a photograph of himself photographing the steel mills. Smith was fascinated by the steel mills and made amazing photographs in and out of the mills. And he made exciting photographs of the neighborhoods of Pittsburgh and also the people at work and at home. However, this project went far beyond the limitations set by Magnum, and afterwards Smith found it difficult to get a job as a photojournalist. In 1957, he left his family in New York and moved by himself into a building on 6th Avenue in New York City. Smith made his studio on the 4th floor where he lived, and over the next several years, he divided his time between photographs taken of the street below and of his interest in jazz and jazz performance, which took place on another floor in a loft which he sponsored. Here on the right, you see Smith and his array of cameras set up to watch the street below. And on the left, you see one of the shots. This building was in the flower district of Chelsea, and many of the photographs he took represent people buying and selling flowers. You can also see on the right that Smith had painted the inside of the windows black, but when one of the panes broke, its jagged shards of glass would later become a motif in many of his images. Smith's images of the jazz loft became the obsession of the next 8 years. He made photographs of people meeting to play, to practice and perform, and the parties that took place there. Smith also wired the building and had microphones on each floor, even at street level, and made thousands of hours of tapes and tens of thousands of photographs of experiences in the jazz loft. On the right, you see Thelonious Monk's band practicing. During these years, however, Smith seldom went out and began to experience personal problems. He abused alcohol and became a drug addict. Nevertheless, visiting him at his loft in New York became a pilgrimage for many young photographers. One of the most important of these was Robert Frank. On the right here, we see a teenage Larry Clark visiting Eugene Smith in his loft. In 1969, Smith finally received a Guggenheim grant to continue his photography, and a retrospective exhibition at the Jewish Museum was mounted in 1971. At that time, he and his second wife, Eileen, moved to Japan. They arrived in Tokyo and soon settled in the small seaside village of Minamata, and there Smith began a long photo essay on the villagers who were suffering from mercury disease and the pollution caused by the fisheries of Minamata. And here you see two images from that series, the fisheries on the left and one of the workers who is being cared for by his wife in his small family home. Smith's photo essay on Minamata was published in Life magazine in 1972 and became an artist's book in 1973. This is the most famous photograph from Smith's Minamata photo essay, representing the child Tomoku cradled in the bath by her mother, and documenting in one powerful image the effects of mercury poisoning on the villagers and on successive generations of their children. I'm David Acton, Curator of Photographs at the Snipe Museum. Thanks for joining us, and come back again for another review from our exhibition, Touchstones of the 20th Century.